Imagine, it's the late 1960s, the summer of love is fading into an autumn of anxiety in California. You live on an isolated ranch, a refuge from the hustle of Los Angeles. One day, a new group settles in nearby. They seem harmless, barefoot, long-haired kids singing songs around a campfire. Their leader is a small man with magnetic eyes and a hypnotic charisma that seems to promise freedom and enlightenment. His name is Charlie. He talks of a new age, of love, and of breaking society's rules. But listen closely to the lyrics of his songs. Notice the vacant stares and fanatical devotion of his followers. Feel the darkness hiding just behind his smile. You aren't living next to a hippie guru. You're living next to a master manipulator forging a human weapon out of lost youth. Today we'll explore the abyss behind those eyes and show you why living next to Charles Manson wasn't about finding peace, but about staring into the apocalypse itself. And you most certainly would not survive it. In the twilight of the 1960s, amidst the dust and isolation of the California canyons, life next to the Manson family might at first glance have been mistaken for a countercultural dream. To the casual observer, Spahn Ranch, a decaying former Western movie set, was not the epicenter of a looming nightmare, but a bohemian sanctuary, a vibrant commune that seemed to be the very personification of the summer of love. The facade that Charles Manson meticulously constructed was not that of a lurking demon, but of a barefoot messiah, a prophet of a new age. He presented himself as a wandering musician, a poet whose songs and philosophies promised his followers an escape from the clutches of a society they saw as corrupt, materialistic, and suffocating. Manson was the charismatic patriarch to a congregation of lost souls, young people who had broken away from their families and the establishment, desperately seeking a sense of identity and belonging. He offered them exactly that, a purpose, a community, and a leader who seemed to understand their deepest pains. The nights at the ranch were a spectacle of apparent harmony. Bonfires crackled, casting dancing silhouettes against the rocky canyon walls, while the sound of guitars and choral voices echoed through the air, singing of love, freedom, and the rejection of social norms. During the day, the family engaged in tasks that reinforced this image of rustic simplicity. They cared for the ranch's rental horses, mended old fences, and lived communally, sharing resources and responsibilities. For George Spahn, the 80-year-old blind and lonely owner, the arrival of Manson and his followers was a relief. They became his eyes, his arms, and his constant company. Manson, a master of manipulation, paid special attention to Spahn, listening to his stories and ensuring he felt revered and in control, a king in his crumbling kingdom. This was the public image, the tapestry carefully woven for the outside world, a peaceful and self-sufficient collective, guided by a visionary who only wanted to build a paradise far from the chaos of the world. However, for a neighbor who dared to look beyond the surface, the daily routine at Spahn Ranch began to emit dissonant signals, small anomalies that, when added up, painted a disturbing picture. The red flags were not glaring but were unsettling whispers on the desert wind. The flow of people and vehicles defied any logic of a simple life. Dune buggies, crudely modified and garishly painted, would depart in silent convoys in the dead of night, tearing through the darkness, only to return in the gray hours just before dawn. Their occupants, once full of life, would come back with a ghostly quietness, their eyes sunken and empty, as if they had witnessed or participated in something that had stolen their souls. The visitors the ranch received were equally alarming. Members of motorcycle gangs like the feared Satan's slaves were frequent guests, their presence bringing a wave of palpable aggression and danger that shattered the illusion of peace and love. They didn't come to sing songs, but to negotiate. Their conversations with Manson always secretive and tense. There was also the practice of creepy crawling, nocturnal incursions where family members would break into homes in the suburbs of Los Angeles, not to steal valuables, but to subtly rearrange the furniture, a psychological warfare tactic to leave residents with the feeling that their safety was an illusion. The sound emanating from the camp also changed. The soft melodies were gradually replaced by Manson's increasingly feverish and paranoid speeches. For hours on end, his voice would cut through the night, preaching about an apocalyptic race war, Helter Skelter, which he claimed to have deciphered from the subtext of the Beatles' White Album. The songs he composed became hymns of submission, their lyrics transformed into direct commands, weaving a web of mental control over his followers. Imagine a chance encounter, a moment that could seal your fate. You're driving down the isolated road leading to the ranch when a tire blows. Before despair can set in, a dune buggy pulls up beside you. It's Manson, accompanied by 2 or 3 of his girls. He smiles, a grin that seems to light up his face and offers help with a disarming confidence. His speech is a hypnotic flow of ideas. He looks directly into your eyes, making you feel understood, seen in a way you never have been before. He invites you to join them at the bonfire that night, to share their food, their music, their truth. The generosity is so overwhelming that refusing feels like an act of ingratitude. But it's in this moment of proximity that the alarm bell sounds in your mind. His smile is a mask that fails to hide the coldness in his eyes. They don't express warmth. They assess, measure, dissect. They are the eyes of a predator calculating the strength of its prey. You notice the absolute, unquestioning devotion of his followers. They don't just admire him. They worship him, hanging on every syllable he utters. Their face is a mixture of adoration and fear. The dynamic is clear. He is not a leader, he is a master, and they are not followers, they are slaves. The hand he extends to help you up is not a gesture of kindness. It is the first link in a chain. You realize with a chilling certainty that the hippie community next door is not a safe haven. It is a forge, where a master manipulator is shaping vulnerable young people into a human weapon. And the invitation to dinner is in fact an invitation to step closer to the abyss. The illusion of a harmless hippie community, already frayed by the strangeness of its routine, was destined to be pulverized in the most definitive and bloody way. Charles Manson's mask didn't just fall, it shattered, revealing an abyss of depravity that would shock the world and redefine the very nature of evil. The emblematic crime that served as the terrifying climax of his philosophy was the series of murders on the nights of August 9th and 10th, 1969, known forever as the Tate LaBianca murders. This was not a random act of violence, but the meticulous orchestration of a maestro of chaos, the culmination of months of indoctrination and psychological manipulation. On the first night, Manson dispatched 4 of his most loyal followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to a residence on Cielo Drive, an affluent area of Los Angeles. The order was clear and brutal, to totally destroy everyone inside, in the most gruesome way possible. The house belonged to director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant. What followed was a massacre of almost unimaginable savagery. 4 people in the house: Tate, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and her boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski, were hunted down and killed with a combination of stabbings and gunshots. A young visitor, Stephen Parent, was shot to death in his car before he could even escape the property. The scene left behind was a macabre testament to the family's fury. Mutilated bodies and the word pig scrawled in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door. The brutality wasn't a byproduct. It was the objective. Manson wanted to create an event so shocking that a panicked society would believe his helter-skelter prophecy was coming true. The following night, dissatisfied with what he considered a sloppy execution, Manson decided to participate personally. He led a group of 6 followers, including the killers from the previous night plus Leslie Van Houten and Steve Clem Grogan, in search of new victims. Chance led them to the home of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary in Los Feliz. Manson entered the house first, subduing the couple with a gun before tying them up. Then he left and gave the orders to Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten. The same savagery, the same message of terror. The LaBiancas were stabbed dozens of times. The killers used the victims' blood to write "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, and the word "Helter Skelter," misspelled, on the refrigerator door. Manson's modus operandi was now terrifyingly clear. He didn't get his own hands dirty, at least not in the final act. His weapon was the fanatical loyalty and fractured minds of his followers. He chose them based on their vulnerability. Young people from broken homes, drug users, individuals who felt invisible to the world. Through a toxic cocktail of LSD, communal sex, isolation at the ranch, and above all his apocalyptic sermons, he dismantled their identities and rebuilt them in his own image. He was their father, their lover, their savior, and their god. His signature wasn't a specific weapon, but the psychological manipulation that turned flower children into death automatons, capable of committing acts of extreme violence without question, believing they were igniting a sacred revolution. The murders were not the end, but the means to an end, to incite a war that would elevate him to the position of leader of a new world. For you, the neighbor, the connection between these events and the noisy commune next door would be a terror that unfolded in slow motion. Imagine hearing the morning news, the shocked voice of the announcer describing the carnage on Cielo Drive. The words cult, ritualistic, and savage echo in your mind. You feel a chill, a vague sense of familiarity with the described madness, but the direct connection still seems impossible. However, the following night, you might have noticed the dune buggy leaving Spawn Ranch again, quieter and more furtive than usual. Perhaps you saw the figures returning before dawn, their clothes dark, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and manic elation. The horror would become personal and immediate as the details began to emerge. As the news spoke of a word written in blood on a door, you would remember Manson's speeches you'd overheard from a distance, his diatribes against the pigs of society. While the initially baffled Los Angeles police searched for motives linked to drugs or revenge, you would realize that the man who offered you a smile and a dinner invitation was, in fact, washing knives and burning bloody clothes just a few hundred feet from your home. The brutal truth would no longer be a distant news story. It would be your neighbor. The sound of the guitar that once seemed harmless would now sound like the soundtrack to a massacre. Every member of the family who passed by your property would no longer be a lost youth, but a potential killer awaiting an order. The mask had fallen, and behind it was not a man, but a vacuum, a black hole of ego and hatred that had managed to turn California's dream of peace and love into the purest and most terrifying American nightmare. With the truth about the Tate LaBianca murders slowly coming to light, the danger of living next to Charles Manson transcended the threat of direct physical attack. The real terror manifested in a more insidious and paralyzing form, the ecosystem of fear that he and his family cultivated around them. This was not a reign of power in the traditional sense, with armies and defined territories, but a psychological dominion, a web of intimidation and uncertainty that extended far beyond the boundaries of Spawn Ranch. The first layer of his power lay in the neutralization of local authorities. Manson didn't have politicians or judges on his payroll like a mafia boss, but he understood and exploited the flaws and complacency of the system. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department initially saw the family as little more than a group of troublesome hippies, responsible for petty theft and drug use. Police raids on the ranch were frequent, but often ineffective, hampered by poorly executed warrants or the difficulty of finding concrete evidence amidst the chaos of the camp. Manson, in turn, used these encounters to reinforce his image as a persecuted martyr to his followers, thereby strengthening their loyalty. More sinisterly, he employed direct intimidation tactics. Potential witnesses or people who knew too much were threatened. The case of Barbara Hoyt, a family member who decided to flee and testify, is a clear example. She was lured to Hawaii by another member with the promise of safety, only to be fed a hamburger laced with a massive dose of LSD in an attempt to kill her or permanently discredit her. The lawyer for one of the family members, Ronald Hughes, disappeared during a trial recess, and his decomposing body was found months later. Many believe he was murdered by the family for his insufficient defense. This was the message. Manson's reach was long, and the system that was supposed to protect citizens was slow, blind, and vulnerable to his audacity. This control, however tenuous, over the forces of law allowed a climate of deep fear to infiltrate the local community. For the neighbors and those who had businesses near Spawn Ranch, silence became a matter of survival. The unspoken rule was clear: see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Reporting the family's suspicious activities was not seen as a civic duty, but as an invitation for retaliation. People knew that the police might pay a visit, ask a few questions, and leave, but the family would remain there, watching, waiting. The fear was fueled by their unpredictability. No one knew what they were capable of, and the rumors that circulated about satanic rituals, celebrity hit lists, and the practice of creepy crawling transformed anxiety into constant dread. Imagine being the owner of a small shop in the nearby town. One day, a few family members walk in, their eyes empty, their manners strangely polite yet menacing. They don't need to say anything. Their reputation precedes them. You serve them, perhaps give them what they want for free just to avoid trouble. You don't look them in the eye for too long. You don't ask questions. And above all, you don't call the police. Living next to them meant locking your doors earlier, looking over your shoulder, seeing every strange car on the street as a potential threat. The fear was a poison that contaminated daily life, turning neighbors into strangers, and the sense of community into a collection of isolated, distrustful islands. The landscape itself, once a rustic refuge, became hostile. Every shadow in the canyon, every sound in the night, a source of alarm. To further complicate this scenario, the public perception of Manson and the family, shaped by the sensationalized media coverage during the trial, was dangerously conflicting. He was not portrayed merely as a monster, but also as a charismatic anti-hero, a rebellious product of the very society that condemned him. The trial footage showed a magnetic and defiant Manson, a swastika carved into his forehead, manipulating not only his followers in the courtroom, who mimicked his gestures and chanted in unison, but also the attention of the global media. For a segment of the counterculture youth, he became a twisted symbol of rebellion, a martyr who dared to radically challenge the establishment. This morbid romanticization made the danger even more confusing and diffuse. The man your neighbor saw as the personification of evil was, to some, a revolutionary icon. This duality created a surreal atmosphere where the line between good and evil, sanity and madness, seemed to have been completely erased. Manson's reign of fear was not based on financial or political power, but on the power of narrative. He crafted a story so potent and terrifying that he managed to paralyze those around him, manipulate the legal system to his advantage for a time, and hijack the cultural imagination of a nation. To live next to him was to have a front-row seat to this theater of the absurd and the terrifying, knowing that at any moment, for no reason at all, the script might demand your participation, and there would be no one to protect you when the curtains closed. Every empire built on the shifting sands of fear and paranoia is fated to crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. Charles Manson's was no exception. The crack that would lead to his downfall was not a masterstroke from a brilliant detective, but rather a combination of banal mistakes and the betrayal born from the very toxic environment he had created. Manson's fatal flaw was his boundless ego and the belief in his own invincibility. After the Tate LaBianca murders, instead of lying low, the family continued their spiral of criminality, engaging in car thefts and credit card fraud. It was a relatively minor crime, the arson of a piece of earth-moving equipment, that led to a raid on Barker Ranch, their new hideout in Death Valley, in October 1969, resulting in the arrest of Manson and several followers. At that moment, the police had not yet connected them to the Los Angeles murders. The real breakthrough came from within. Susan Atkins, already in jail on suspicion of another murder, that of Gary Hinman, began bragging to her cellmates, describing in graphic detail her participation in Sharon Tate's death. She spoke of the taste of Tate's blood, of the terror in the victim's eyes, a confession driven by a mixture of morbid pride and the need to feel important. This indiscretion was the thread that prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi needed. From there, the investigation gained overwhelming focus. Other members, like Linda Kasabian, who served as the driver and lookout during the attacks but did not directly participate in the killings, saw an opportunity to escape Manson's grip and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The loyalty Manson demanded was absolute. but he underestimated his followers' self-preservation instinct when faced with the prospect of the gas chamber. The tireless work of Bugliosi and his team began to connect the pieces, turning whispers and rumors into a solid court case. Manson's final capture for the crime that would immortalize him was not a dramatic shootout, but a bureaucratic formality while he was already in custody. The real drama unfolded in the courtroom, which became Manson's final stage. The trial scene, which began in July 1970, was an unprecedented media circus orchestrated by the defendant himself. Far from appearing like a cornered criminal, Manson behaved as the director of a macabre spectacle. He appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead, a symbol of his removal from society. His followers, camped outside, mimicked the gesture, and later, when he transformed the X into a swastika, they did the same. He would interrupt witnesses, shout at the judge, and deliver incoherent, apocalyptic speeches. The contrast between the powerful figure who had terrorized California and the man in the dock was shocking, but not in the way one might expect. He didn't seem pathetic. He seemed dangerously charismatic, still in full control of his loyal followers who were present in the courtroom. The Manson girls, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, giggled during testimony about the deaths, sang in unison, and displayed a fanatical loyalty that sent a chill through the nation. The trial exposed the depth of the brainwashing he had accomplished. He had created monsters who not only killed on his command, but did so with a terrifying conviction. For the neighbor who once feared the noise from the ranch, watching these scenes on television would be the final confirmation that the evil next door was deeper and stranger than anyone could have possibly imagined. The last days of Manson's empire were spent within prison walls, but his legacy of fear and fascination continued to echo. On January 25, 1971, Manson and the 3 female followers were sentenced to death. However, fate intervened. In 1972, the California Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty, and their sentences were commuted to life in prison. Manson would spend the rest of his life in the California prison system, a span of over 4 decades. He never showed remorse. On the contrary, in countless interviews from behind bars, he continued to preach his distorted philosophy, cultivating his image as an outcast and a prophet. He became a dark cultural icon, receiving fan mail, inspiring music, and becoming an enduring symbol of the dark side of the counterculture. His death occurred on November 19, 2017, from natural causes at the age of 83. He died not in a glorious shootout, as he might have envisioned in his apocalyptic fantasies, but as an old prisoner, a relic of a bygone era. The end of his life was anticlimactic, but the question that lingers serves as a hook for our conclusion. With the death of Charles Manson, did the fear he personified truly disappear? Or do the scars he left on society's psyche, the loss of innocence, the distrust of our neighbors, the proof that evil can hide behind a smile and a song, remain with us to this day? A dark reminder that the darkness you feared in your neighbor might, in fact, be lurking anywhere. Living next to Charles Manson and his family was a brutal and unforgettable lesson. Evil rarely presents itself with horns and a pitchfork. More often than not, it arrives with a smile, a song, and the promise of a better world. Their story reminds us that the true danger lies not just in explicit violence, but in the charismatic manipulation that can turn ordinary people into monsters, and that the deepest darkness can hide beneath the brightest light of idealism. Stories like this force us to look beyond appearances and to question the nature of influence and power. If you are also fascinated by the darker corners of history and want to unravel other complex figures who have shaped our world, join our community of truth seekers and subscribe to the channel. And speaking of evil that hides behind a facade of generosity, Manson's story shows how terror can be born from chaos and psychological manipulation in an isolated commune. But what happens when terror gets organized, dresses in expensive suits, and takes control of an entire city? Not with apocalyptic prophecies, but with calculated violence and a generosity that buys silence. In our next video, we're trading the canyons of California for the streets of Chicago to explore life next to a man who was both a beloved philanthropist and America's most feared gangster. Click here to discover Why you couldn't survive living next to Al Capone.